So growing up, you probably are not surprised to learn that I primarily read science fiction and fantasy books, at least as far as the fiction books that I read. Eventually, once I got into university, I'd read a lot more urban fantasy or horror, but at the time, I wasn't really into that. When I was younger, I guess kind of in earlier to mid grade school, I tended to read more fantasy. So stuff like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, um, a lot of David Eddings books, a lot of Margaret Wise books, a lot of other generic fantasy books that I can't remember the names of. But eventually I kind of grew tired of it because it either seemed to be just Tolkien hacks who produce the same dwarves, elves, human D&D, Lord of the Rings ripoff nonsense that was always the same, or it was some like quirky fantasy thing that was like David Eddings but was written much worse. So I couldn't really take it anymore, so I started to read more sci-fi. Stuff like Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, um, eventually Star Wars novels, stuff like that. And one day my father came to me and he's like, "Here, son, why don't you try giving this a read?" I think I was about 12 or 13 at the time. And he was like, he handed me this copy of Dune, a old paperback, and he's like, "This was my favorite book. I read this a whole bunch of times as a kid. I think you'll find it interesting." So I started reading Dune and I was hooked pretty much from the beginning. There are a lot of complaints you can say about Frank Herbert. I don't think you can say that he's not an original writer, that he doesn't try to be creative, that he doesn't take chances, that he doesn't try to do something a little bit different, that it's not just, and I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the timelines exactly, but it's not just another rip-off of Asimov or another rip-off of Robot or Foundation or any of these generic, sterile, hard sci-fi, really kind of bland things. He tries to make his own universe, make it very unique aesthetically, culturally, religiously. I think he really tries to take the idea of humanity as this kind of blended culture that's so far in the future that the memories of Earth have faded, and you have just kind of all these weird things that don't really fit together, and take that seriously and try to make something out of it. Aside from that, a lot of his writings come across as someone who's exploring the issues themselves, not as someone who already has all the answers because he's a reductionist materialist, but as someone who's trying to look at history, to try to look at archetypes, to try to look at politics from different angles, and is using his work to kind of explore these themes. And he's not really afraid to put weird stuff in, to have a lot of internal monologues, to have visions, to have like metaphysical, esoteric concepts that you wouldn't really get in more hard sci-fi and things like that. And I just really, really enjoyed it. And I kind of keep coming back to it. Like later on, I read the original, I think, 4 Foundation books. And it really just kind of stuck out to me how good a writer Frank Herbert is. And once again, there's a lot of complaints you can make that there's too much exposition, there's too much random side stuff, the universe is too complicated, things aren't explained. But I'll take that any day off of like another bland Arthur C. Clarke, what I like to call flat earth atheist, there's no metaphysical reality novel. That's probably also the reason why a lot of people like Philip K. Dick. Because once again, he talks a lot more about the spiritual and esoteric dimension. I think Frank Herbert is unarguably a much, much better writer than Philip K. Dick, but that's neither here nor there. So I think the fact that he tried to do something creative and he tried to do something very different and it largely worked is a big thing in his favor. Maybe the only other sci-fi writer I've read that other than Philip K. Dick, I can really put in that category would maybe be someone like Heinlein. But I can't read Heinlein because he's too degenerate. Like all his books involve like polygamy and free love and all this other just disgusting stuff that I can't stomach. Definitely read Starship Troopers though. Starship Troopers is really good. But yeah, so I think that's Frank Herbert's advantage. I think part of it, and this is just from, I think it's called Dreamer of Dune, and I've read parts of that. I've tried to do some secondary research, and to just kind of extrapolate from the books I've read. Frank Herbert has kind of an interesting political, religious perspective for a sci-fi writer, and for a writer in general. And sometimes it's good to have someone kind of do their take on things that's just completely outside of it, like outside the political spectrum, outside the religious spectrum, just kind of an outsider, or even if not an outsider, someone who doesn't directly kind of conform to looking in on the thing. So Frank Herbert, as best as I can determine politically, you could probably call a green conservative. From my understanding, he was a lifelong Republican. I think he was a speechwriter for a California Republican. He really, really hated communism. If you read Hellstrom's Hive, you can see how much he despised communism. And if you kind of start going through the books, you do see some definite social conservative things, particularly when it comes to sexual orientation. I would even argue in terms of like the family structure. Like, there is a lot of bemoaning that Leto didn't marry Jessica. There's a lot of bemoaning that Paul didn't marry Chani, and they're in kind of like this illegitimate relationship. That's at least how I kind of read it. I think an important part thing to put in the mind of when you're reading Dune or watching something is a lot of it's not supposed to be didactic. Like, the Bene Gesserit, I don't think are supposed to be good. So when they like sexually dominate men and stuff like that, I don't think that's supposed to be like a good thing, or him endorsing free love or anything like that. If anything, once you get to the Honored Martyrs, it really like is just completely fucked what like sex has done to kind of the galaxy, with like this female elite basically making all of society into their simps by sexually enslaving them, and just weird stuff like that. And I think generally speaking, there is somewhat of a correlation in Frank Herbert between characters' sexual morality and their personal behavior, or who are kind of considered good characters. Like, if you consider the characters who I guess you could say more are good, I would definitely put Leto as a good character. He is faithful to Jessica. He doesn't have a bunch of other lovers. She's basically his wife for all intents and purposes. He is a family man who's involved in raising his son. He does love his son a lot. I know this is in the prequels, but like Xavier Harkonnen is another kind of monogamous guy, a family man. He loves his kids a lot. Whereas Iblis Geno is kind of his counterpart, who's like a degenerate that uses his position to sexually molest women and stuff like that. So I do think there is an aspect of that to it. And the other aspect to it, and we'll get into where these two things kind of coalesce, is Frank Herbert's religious affiliation is kind of difficult, because he identified as a Zen Buddhist, but he was raised Catholic, and you can see very, very strong influence on both. I think he probably was a perennialist, would be the best description. It's a bit like when you're trying to politically describe Tolkien. I think a somewhat fair label would be to call like Tolkien a paleoconservative, although that's a very anachronistic. But you're just trying to find something that roughly correlates to what you're thinking of. So I call Frank Herbert kind of a perennialist, because religion in his books is very seldom portrayed as a negative thing in of itself. Generally speaking, I find spirituality, even if it's can kind of be generic and weird, tends to be positive, or at least neutral. So perennialism is basically the idea that all religions come from a primordial source. I mean, there's different variations of it. Some will say that it's all religions are kind of equal. They're all kind of paths to God, or paths to the divine, or the one, or something like that, in kind of a Neoplatonic sense. Some will be more focused within the context of like a specific religion, like other religions contain some truth, but they're all just kind of reflections of Islam or Christianity or something like that. And I get that feeling a lot from Frank Herbert, because he never really directly denigrates religion or people who believe in it. What he does denigrate, and I think it's important to make this distinction, is primarily people who use religion for cynical political purposes. Like, the Bene Gesserit are like flat earth atheists, as far as I can determine. They pretend to be a religious order. They'll sometimes make reference to God or prophecies or stuff like that. But really, it's just a cynical way to control people. And that's not portrayed as a good thing. And even the entire point of like Dune Messiah is that Paul's assumption of the position of Messiah for cynical political purposes has led to like a disaster. It's destabilized the galaxy. It's led to, they're very clear that it's a false religion. They're worshiping just this dude who's not a god, who's not divine, who's deeply flawed. And it just spirals out of control. And you have the Paul's jihad that kills billions and billions of people throughout the galaxy. And he finds he's trapped by it. And kind of the madness just continues once his sister takes over. And then Leto becomes worshipped as a god. And none of this really seems to be portrayed as being a good thing. Nor is it really portrayed as being a issue with religion or belief in and of itself. I don't think the Fremen's religious beliefs are really ever portrayed particularly negatively. What really kind of screws the Fremen is, so the Bene Gesserit have, the mission of Protectiva, I forget how you pronounce it exactly, but they've spread this prophecy throughout the galaxy of like a Bene Gesserit woman coming with a child who's going to be the Messiah. So if they ever find themselves alone on a planet, they have this subconscious thing they can use to control the local population. And that's been embedded within the Fremen as well, as with pretty much everything else. Once again, if you were looking at, I get that people don't like the prequels, but the Butlerian Jihad initially was seen as kind of a good thing, because it united humanity in a quest, a spiritual alliance to fight the thinking machines. But Iblis Geno kind of hijacked it and turned it into his own political power base to try to kind of become the leader of the human race. So I do very much get that Frank Herbert is sympathetic to it. I don't really recall there being that many what I call flat earth atheist characters who are portrayed as being super sympathetic or that particular ideology. It's more about like corrupt fake political religions. I almost kind of wonder to a certain extent if part of the reason why Dune has all these weird billion syncretic religions, other than Herbert just trying to kind of create what he thinks a mixed humanity would look like 20,000 years in the future, or however long in the future it is. But maybe it's because he doesn't want to deal with the issue of Jesus or a lot of the real world religions. I'll say that I do find, and I kind of wish we learned more about Zen Sunniism, because in a weird way, it does kind of make sense to mix Zen Buddhism and Islam. Because a core component of Islam is that God is completely unknowable and alien. And a core part of Buddhism is nirvana or whatever is unknowable. And a lot of the exercises are about clearing your mind. You have the cone where you try to focus on an unsolvable problem. You try to kind of gain enlightenment. And I do think those two things do kind of have a relationship. There's also a strong orthopraxic aspect of it with like meditation and daily prayers and stuff like that. So the two, I think, mesh together a lot better than you might initially think. And once again, kudos to him for trying to do something kind of creative and a bit different and somewhat interesting. So that's just kind of my thoughts on Frank in general. Great writer. I need to read some of his other stuff. I've just read the Dune books in Hellstrom's Hive, but I need to look at some other things he's written. Anyways, blessings of Buddha Allah go with you, and talk to you guys later.